You think Monday night was just another episode of Raw? You think when those arena lights dimmed and production wrapped that everyone simply packed up and went home? What unfolded in those empty corridors after millions stopped watching will shake everything you believed about where this story was heading. The tribal chief made a move nobody saw coming, and the reverberations are going to change the entire landscape of professional wrestling. If you're hungry for the real story that's been kept under wraps, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're diving deep into territory the mainstream outlets won't touch. What I'm about to reveal will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about the power dynamics in WWE right now. Roman Reigns wasn't scheduled to be backstage after the show ended. His itinerary had him departing immediately following the broadcast, yet he remained in the building for reasons that only became clear hours later. While crew members broke down equipment and talent filtered out to their hotels, the head of the table was orchestrating something significant behind closed doors. Security personnel were instructed to clear a specific section of the backstage area, and production staff found themselves redirected away from corridors they normally had full access to. This level of privacy isn't requested for casual conversations or routine business meetings. This was intentional, calculated, and designed to keep prying eyes away from what was about to go down. The atmosphere backstage had already been charged with tension throughout the entire evening. Whispers had been circulating among crew members about potential confrontations and unresolved business that needed addressing. Several superstars had noticed Roman's demeanor during the show, the way he carried himself with purpose that extended beyond his scheduled segments. There was an energy radiating from him that veterans recognized as the prelude to something significant. When word started spreading that he hadn't left the building despite having no official reason to remain, speculation exploded among those still present in the arena. Jimmy and G were in their locker room completely unaware of what was about to transpire. They'd finished their matches, completed their post-show responsibilities, and were decompressing like any other night on the road. The brothers were actually in good spirits, discussing their performance and joking about moments from the show. Their recent run had been successful by any measure, proving they could thrive independently without being defined solely by their association with their cousin. They'd carved out their own identity and earned respect on their own merits, which made them feel more secure in their individual value. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on their door, the kind that carry weight and intention. The laughter stopped immediately. The room fell silent. Those who heard it knew immediately whose presence had arrived. That particular cadence has become synonymous with one person, and when you hear it, you understand that whatever happens next matters. Jimmy and G exchanged glances, a wordless communication that only siblings can share, both asking the same question without speaking. Neither moved immediately toward the door because they were processing the implications of who was standing on the other side. The knocking came again, 3 more measured strikes against the door, patient but insistent. Jimmy finally stood up and walked toward the entrance, his body language showing both caution and curiosity. His hand hesitated on the handle for just a moment before he pulled it open, and there stood Roman, not in his ring gear but in street clothes, looking less like the larger-than-life character television audiences see and more like a family member showing up for a serious conversation. The initial reaction from the twins was visible shock because despite sharing bloodlines and history, their recent path had taken them in directions that created distance. Months of tension and unspoken conflict had built walls between them, making this unexpected visit feel surreal. Roman didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the locker room with the confidence of someone who belonged there, but his energy wasn't aggressive or confrontational. His eyes moved between both brothers, reading their reactions, gauging their receptiveness to whatever he'd come to say. G had stood up from his seat but remained at a distance, his posture defensive without being hostile. The 3 of them formed a triangle in the center of the room, each occupying their own space, the physical distance reflecting emotional gaps that had widened over time. What happened next defied all expectations based on their recent interactions. Roman didn't arrive with demands or ultimatums. He didn't come bearing the authoritative presence he projects in the ring. Instead, he acknowledged them with words that caught everyone within earshot off guard. He told them directly that they represented the absolute best of what tag team wrestling could be, that their work ethic and dedication to their craft set standards others could only aspire to reach. Coming from someone who rarely distributes praise freely, these words carried immense significance. Jimmy's arms remained crossed, his expression skeptical, while G's defensive posture softened slightly as he processed what he was hearing. Roman continued, his voice steady and measured, explaining that he'd been watching their recent performances not just as family but as a student of the business. He detailed specific moments from their matches that demonstrated psychology and timing that separated great teams from good ones. He talked about how they'd elevated opponents and made everyone they worked with look better, which was the mark of true professionals. This wasn't generic flattery or empty compliments designed to manipulate. Roman was breaking down their craft with the kind of detail that showed genuine attention and respect for what they were accomplishing. People backstage positioned close enough to hear fragments of the conversation reported that Roman spoke about legacy and family in ways that seemed genuinely heartfelt rather than strategically manipulative. He talked about how their shared heritage meant something bigger than individual accomplishments or temporary disagreements. The bloodline concept wasn't just a marketing angle or storyline device in that moment, it represented generations of tradition and expectations they all carried. Roman emphasized that what they built together transcended typical professional relationships because it was rooted in something deeper than business. He invoked the names of their grandfathers and fathers, legends who had paved the way for all of them to stand in WWE locker rooms having these conversations. The weight of family history hung heavy in that room. All three of them carried the burden of legendary surnames and the expectations that came with them. They'd all felt the pressure of living up to standards set by previous generations while trying to forge their own identities within the wrestling world. Roman acknowledged this shared experience, admitting that the pressure had sometimes made him act in ways that prioritized maintaining legacy over preserving relationships. He confessed that the fear of failing to live up to what came before had driven him to control situations and people more than was healthy or necessary. The meeting stretched beyond 20 minutes, an eternity in the fast-paced backstage environment where superstars typically handle business quickly and move on. During this extended conversation, G reportedly displayed emotional responses to what was being discussed. Not anger or defensiveness, but genuine reactions that suggested Roman's words were resonating in ways that surprised even him. After everything they'd experienced together, the manipulations and power struggles and fractured trust, hearing Roman speak with apparent sincerity created an emotional impact. G's eyes reflected internal conflict, the war between wanting to believe what he was hearing and protecting himself from potential disappointment. Jimmy maintained more guarded body language throughout the discussion according to those who observed from a distance. His track record of questioning authority and pushing back against control made him naturally skeptical of sudden reconciliation attempts. He listened intently, but his expressions revealed someone processing information carefully rather than accepting it at face value. This dynamic between the brothers created an interesting tension because while G seemed moved by the conversation, Jimmy remained analytical about the implications and potential motivations behind it. At several points, Jimmy interjected with pointed questions that cut through emotional appeals to address practical concerns about how any renewed alliance would actually function. Roman addressed their concerns about past conflicts with unexpected directness. He didn't try to rewrite history or pretend previous issues hadn't occurred. Instead, he acknowledged mistakes and times when his leadership style had created unnecessary friction. This level of accountability was unprecedented coming from someone who built his persona on being unquestionably right and absolutely in control. The fact that he was willing to admit fault, even privately, signaled a shift in approach that couldn't be dismissed as mere manipulation. He specifically referenced moments where his demands had been unreasonable and times when he prioritized his own agenda over collective benefit. Roman told them about the loneliness that comes with standing at the top, about how isolating it becomes when you push away everyone who matters in pursuit of maintaining power. He admitted that winning at the cost of family had started feeling hollow, that championship reigns and accolades meant less when you had nobody you trusted to share those moments with. This vulnerability was shocking coming from someone who'd spent years projecting invincibility. Jimmy's posture shifted slightly at this admission, his arms uncrossing as he leaned against the wall, still cautious but no longer closed off. The conversation covered practical matters as well, including how their alliance moving forward would be structured differently than before. Roman proposed a partnership model where decisions would involve input from all three rather than unilateral declarations from the top. He suggested they could maintain individual identities and pursue separate goals while still supporting each other when situations demanded unified action. This framework addressed many of Jimmy's concerns about losing autonomy within the group dynamic. Roman emphasized that he wasn't asking them to become extensions of his will but rather to function as equals working toward compatible objectives. Discussion turned toward future opportunities and what they could accomplish together versus separately. Roman painted a picture of championship reigns and spotlight moments that would elevate all of them to unprecedented levels. He wasn't promising handouts or unearned rewards, but rather outlining how their combined talents could create opportunities none of them could generate alone. The mathematics of their alliance made strategic sense even beyond familial obligations. He talked about main event positions at premium events, about how their combined star power could negotiate better terms and conditions, about how they could use their collective leverage to shape their own narratives rather than having stories dictated to them. Roman detailed specific scenarios where having each other's backs would create advantages that extended beyond ring competition. He talked about the political landscape within WWE, about factions and alliances forming that could threaten any of them individually but would struggle against a unified front. He explained how certain people in positions of influence had been working to keep them divided because they knew the threat they posed together. This wasn't paranoia or conspiracy theory. Roman provided specific examples of decisions that had been made to keep them apart and weaken their collective bargaining position. She asked pointed questions about trust and whether they could truly count on each other when pressure mounted and difficult choices had to be made. Roman's response reportedly involved specific examples of times they'd succeeded because they trusted each other completely, and contrasting those with recent failures that stemmed from fractured communication and divided focus. He argued convincingly that their strength had always derived from unity, and weakness only appeared when they allowed external forces to create internal division. He reminded them of matches they'd won against impossible odds because they moved as one unit, anticipating each other's actions and covering each other's vulnerabilities. The conversation then shifted to even more personal territory as Roman opened up about the toll that their fractured relationship had taken on him mentally. He described nights lying awake replaying arguments and wondering if pride was worth the cost of damaged family bonds. He talked about moments of triumph that felt empty because the people he wanted to celebrate with weren't speaking to him. This raw honesty created a shift in the room's energy. Both brothers were now fully engaged in the conversation, leaning forward, making eye contact, processing not just Roman's words but the emotion behind them. Jimmy shared his own frustrations about feeling controlled and manipulated during their previous alliance. He explained how the constant power dynamics and need to prove loyalty had worn him down and made him question his own judgment. He detailed specific instances where he'd felt his opinions were dismissed or his concerns were minimized because they didn't align with Roman's vision. Getting these grievances out in the open was cathartic, and more importantly, Roman listened without becoming defensive or making excuses. He absorbed the criticism, nodded in acknowledgement, and validated Jimmy's feelings without trying to explain them away. He added his own perspective about feeling caught between loyalty to family and loyalty to himself. He described the internal conflict of wanting to support Roman while also needing to establish his own identity separate from anyone's shadow. He talked about the pressure of always being seen as part of a unit rather than as an individual with his own talents and capabilities. Roman acknowledged these feelings and admitted he'd contributed to that dynamic by often treating them as extensions of his will rather than as complete performers in their own right. The meeting's tone shifted when Roman brought up external threats they all faced. He detailed competitors rising through the ranks who viewed any of them as obstacles to overcome. He outlined how certain elements within the company structure would prefer seeing them neutralized because their collective power threatened established hierarchies. His point was clear: divided they became vulnerable to forces that couldn't touch them when they stood together. He provided insider information about backstage conversations he'd overheard where people discussed strategies for keeping them separated and ensuring they never reunited. Roman revealed that certain booking decisions over recent months had been specifically designed to keep them on opposite sides and prevent any opportunity for reconciliation. He explained how storylines had been constructed to maximize conflict between them and minimize chances for natural interaction that might lead to healing their relationship. Understanding that their division had been artificially maintained and encouraged by outside forces changed the context of their conflict. It wasn't just natural drift or personal disagreements, there had been active interference working to keep them apart. Jimmy countered with concerns about repeating past patterns that had proven destructive. He didn't want to rebuild something just to watch it collapse again under the weight of egos and conflicting ambitions. Roman acknowledged this risk but suggested they'd all grown from previous experiences and could apply those lessons to create something more sustainable. He emphasized that maturity and perspective changes what people prioritize and how they handle disagreements. He proposed establishing clear boundaries and communication protocols from the beginning so issues could be addressed before they festered into major conflicts. The three of them discussed establishing ground rules for how their renewed alliance would function. They talked about weekly check-ins where they could voice concerns before they became problems. They discussed dividing responsibilities and respecting each other's areas of expertise. Jimmy wanted assurances that creative decisions would involve genuine collaboration, and Roman agreed to joint approval on storylines that involved all of them. She wanted guarantees that they could pursue individual opportunities without feeling like they were betraying the group, and Roman not only agreed but encouraged them to maintain separate identities and goals. As the conversation wound down, Roman proposed they take time to consider everything discussed rather than demanding immediate commitments. This approach contrasted sharply with his previous style of expecting instant loyalty and unquestioning agreement. By giving them space to process and decide, he demonstrated respect for their autonomy and intelligence. It was a calculated move that showed sophistication in his leadership evolution. He told them to think about everything they'd talked about, to discuss it privately between themselves, and to reach out when they'd made a decision. The ball was in their court, and the power dynamic had shifted in a way that acknowledged them as equals. Before leaving, Roman initiated a traditional gesture of respect that held cultural significance for all of them. They pressed forwards together in the center of the room, a physical representation of connection and shared purpose. For anyone familiar with their heritage, this act carried weight beyond what casual observers might recognize. It represented family bonds that transcend professional wrestling storylines and backstage politics. The gesture lasted several seconds, all three men with eyes closed, connecting on a level that went beyond words or strategy. When they separated, the energy in the room had fundamentally transformed from where it started. Roman left without saying anything more, understanding that the moment didn't need additional commentary. The door closed behind him, and for several seconds, neither Jimmy nor G moved or spoke. They were both processing what had just happened, the unexpected nature of the visit, the vulnerability Roman had displayed, and the implications of everything that had been discussed. The silence stretched as they absorbed the weight of the decision they now faced. After Roman departed, the twins remained alone to discuss what had transpired. Reports indicate their conversation lasted another hour as they debated the merits and risks of accepting Roman's proposition. Jimmy expressed skepticism about whether fundamental dynamics had truly changed or if they were being drawn back into familiar patterns with slightly different packaging. He worried that Roman's new approach was temporary, something he'd maintain only until he secured their loyalty again, and then old behaviors would resurface. Jimmy had been burned before by promises that weren't kept and assurances that proved hollow. G argued that Roman's approach had been different enough to warrant serious consideration and that dismissing it outright would be short-sighted. He pointed out specific moments in the conversation where Roman could have reverted to manipulation tactics but chose vulnerability instead. G felt that the level of self-awareness Roman displayed wasn't something that could be faked, and the willingness to establish boundaries and protocols suggested genuine commitment to doing things differently. He reminded Jimmy that people could grow and change, and that holding past mistakes against someone forever prevented any possibility of healing. Their discussion revealed differing perspectives on what success looked like moving forward. She seemed more drawn to the legacy aspect and what reuniting could mean for their long-term place in wrestling history. He talked about how their family name would be remembered, about the stories future generations would tell about what they accomplished together. He felt that letting personal grudges prevent them from maximizing their collective potential would be a waste of the opportunities their bloodline had created. The chance to cement their place among the greatest factions in wrestling history was too significant to dismiss over pride or lingering resentment. Jimmy focused more on immediate practical concerns about creative control and whether they'd have genuine input or just the illusion of partnership. He wanted concrete evidence that Roman's promises would translate into actual behavioral changes rather than just nice-sounding words spoken in private. Jimmy suggested they could test the waters slowly, engage with Roman on smaller projects first to see if he followed through on collaborative decision-making before committing to a full reunion. This cautious approach would protect them from getting pulled back into unhealthy dynamics while still leaving the door open for reconciliation if Roman proved genuine. Both perspectives held validity, and their inability to reach immediate consensus highlighted the complexity of their situation. They went back and forth, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, but always respecting each other's concerns and viewpoints. This was the kind of honest communication they'd maintained throughout their careers, the foundation that made their tag team work so effectively. They could disagree without damaging their relationship because their bond as brothers transcended professional conflicts. Jimmy brought up concerns about how other superstars would perceive them if they reunited with Roman. Some people might see it as weakness, as crawling back to someone who'd treated them poorly. Others might view it as a strategic power play designed to consolidate control at the top. Either way, there would be judgment and commentary from people who didn't understand the full context. Jimmy wondered if they were prepared to handle that external scrutiny while navigating the internal dynamics of their renewed alliance. She countered that their decision shouldn't be dictated by other people's opinions or perceptions. What mattered was whether reuniting served their interests and aligned with their values. If they believed Roman's commitment to doing things differently was genuine, and if they felt the strategic advantages outweighed the risks, then outside commentary was irrelevant. They'd spent their entire careers dealing with people's opinions about their family connections, their rise through the company, and their accomplishments. Learning to tune out noise that didn't matter was part of surviving in the wrestling business. The brothers discussed the potential impact on their individual careers if they chose different paths. What if Jimmy declined while G accepted? Could their tag team survive if they had different relationships with Roman? Would it create tension between them that had never existed before? Neither wanted their own choices to damage their partnership, which was the most important professional relationship either of them had. They agreed that whatever decision they reached needed to preserve their brotherhood above all else. As the night grew later and exhaustion started setting in, they decided to table the discussion and revisit it with fresh perspectives. Some decisions couldn't be rushed, and this was definitely one that deserved careful consideration. They agreed to sleep on it, continue thinking through implications, and talk again soon. Neither felt pressure to rush to a conclusion, which itself was interesting because Roman's lack of demanding immediate commitment gave them the space to make a thoughtful choice. The following day, interactions between all three at the venue were noticeably different from previous weeks. While nothing was publicly announced or formally acknowledged, body language and brief exchanges suggested a shift in their relationship dynamic. They weren't avoiding each other as they had been, but they also weren't projecting the unified front that characterized their earlier collaboration. It was a transitional phase where everyone involved was feeling out new boundaries. When they passed each other in hallways, there were nods of acknowledgement rather than the cold indifference that had marked recent months. Backstage personnel noticed Roman making uncharacteristic efforts to include the twins in conversations and decisions that didn't directly involve them. Small gestures like asking their input on match layouts or seeking their perspective on booking directions demonstrated follow-through on his promises about collaborative partnership. These actions were being watched carefully by everyone because they would either validate or undermine everything said in that private meeting. Roman seemed aware that his behavior was under scrutiny and made deliberate efforts to demonstrate consistency between his words and actions. During a production meeting that all three attended, Roman actively solicited opinions from Jimmy and G about a proposed storyline direction. He didn't just ask token questions and then dismiss their input, he genuinely engaged with their suggestions and modified plans based on their feedback. This public display of collaborative decision-making sent ripples through everyone present. Veterans who'd worked with Roman for years noticed the change in his approach. Younger talent observed how he incorporated others' ideas rather than dictating terms. The shift in leadership style was tangible and couldn't be dismissed as temporary posturing. The twins responded to these overtures with cautious engagement. They participated in discussions and offered opinions but maintained enough distance to preserve independence. This careful balance reflected their internal debate about how much trust to extend and how quickly to reintegrate after extended separation. Their behavior suggested they were testing whether Roman's new approach would survive contact with everyday realities and pressures. They wanted to see if his collaborative style held up when disagreements arose or when his personal interests conflicted with group consensus. An interesting moment occurred during a creative session when Roman proposed an idea that both twins immediately disagreed with. In the past, such opposition might have created tension or resulted in Roman overriding their concerns. Instead, he asked them to explain their objections, listen to their reasoning, and ultimately agreed that their perspective made more sense. He abandoned his idea in favor of their suggestion without any visible frustration or resentment. This incident became a turning point for Jimmy especially, who saw concrete evidence that Roman was willing to subordinate his ego to better outcomes. Industry observers with knowledge of the situation began speculating about implications for upcoming programming. A reunified faction operating under new parameters could reshape championship pictures and storyline directions across multiple divisions. The creative team was reportedly already workshopping scenarios that could capitalize on renewed chemistry while acknowledging the realistic tensions that existed. The goal was authentic storytelling that reflected complicated relationships rather than pretending everything had magically resolved. Writers were excited about the potential because complicated family dynamics with layers of history provided rich material for compelling television. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we'll be tracking every development in this evolving situation and bringing you information you won't find anywhere else in the wrestling media landscape.